tonight's distinguished speaker, a diplomat whose career has spanned 4 decades at the highest levels of international affairs. Ambassador Maurizio Massari is the permanent representative of Italy to the United Nations, a seasoned diplomat with more than 40 years of service in the Italian diplomatic corps. Ambassador Massari currently serves as a vice president of the 79th United Nations General Assembly. In addition, he was recently elected chair of the UN First Committee on Disarmament for its upcoming 80th session, which underscores his leadership on global security and peace building. Since December 2023, he has been a member of the advisory group of the UN Central Emergency Response Fund, working within the framework of the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. His past roles include Vice President of ECOSOC and of the Executive Board of UN Women. Ambassador Massari's international postings have taken him across the globe, from Moscow to London, Washington, Belgrade, Cairo, Brussels, and back to New York, with key responsibilities in EU affairs, US foreign policy, Balkans, and the Middle East. He has represented Italy both as ambassador and special envoy in times of geopolitical transformation and regional crises. Ambassador Massari received a master's degree in international public policy from Johns Hopkins University and a fellowship at Harvard University's Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. He's the author of influential works on Soviet reforms, post-communist Russia, and European foreign policy. In 2024, he was named Grand Officer of the Order of Merit of the Italian Republic, one of Italy's highest civilian honors. Please join me in welcoming Ambassador Maurizio Massari.
Good evening to everyone. It's a pleasure to spend some time with you to talk about the UN. And also nice to see many colleagues of mine at the UN tonight. This meeting takes place at a particularly critical and dangerous moment for international stability. The Israeli-Iran war adds to the other numerous ongoing conflicts and marks, unfortunately, the failure of diplomacy. More and more, we live in a world where states view military solutions as preferable to diplomatic solutions to guarantee their own security. And we do not know where all this will lead us to. We're moving in uncharted waters. I do not intend to dwell tonight on current affairs. Maybe we can interact in the Q&A on what's going on now in the world. But I just want to stress at the very beginning that today, like never before, we need a stronger global governance, stronger institutions. The alternative is an international anarchy, an obedient world where might makes right. The United Nations epitomizes the global multilateral order created after the end of the Second World War. This year marks the 80th anniversary of its founding. This important anniversary falls at a time in history where multilateralism is under unprecedented pressure due to at least 2 main mega processes. First, the great power competition that has polarized the international system and has impeded the solution of the major conflicts in the world, from Ukraine to Gaza. Middle powers, more and more independent and assertive in their foreign policies, have not helped either in finding solutions to the numerous conflicts. Africa is a case in point. The second mega process has to do with the divisions on foreign policy and on the value of multilateralism and the UN within the US and in general within the West. It has been so far the main champion of multilateralism. This is true not only here in the US, but frankly, to some extent also is true for Europe, whose governments' national agendas too often prevail over the global agenda. As a result of these factors, today we are facing a big paradox. On the one hand, there is a surge in demand for global multilateralism, cooperation among states to address the several global challenges ranging from climate change to pandemics and diseases, poverty, food security, cybersecurity, and so on. All these global challenges, of course, require global solutions. On the other hand, the supply of multilateralism, in other words, the state's ability and willingness to cooperate and pay to tackle common challenges is in deep decline. This supply deficit is at origin, in my view, of the international turmoil and of the global imbalances that we are witnessing and experiencing today. Few figures may suffice to illustrate the current state of the world affairs. Armed conflicts have reached the highest number since the end of World War II. 700 million people are living in conditions of food insecurity. For the first time in 2024, global warming exceeded the 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold compared to the pre-industrial levels. And this trend, according to the UN, will continue in the years ahead until 2029. Many African and low-income countries are in debt distress, which means that their growth is stifled by the debt. 3.3 billion people live in countries that spend more on debt service than on public health. The UN 2030 agenda that was launched 10 years ago, in 2015, alongside its 17 SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals, as the main tool for more equitable economic and social development across the globe, is still 5 years from the set deadline, mostly unattained. Only 70% of SDGs are indeed on track. The 2030 agenda was agreed upon by all states, but now the US is distancing itself from it, and support for the Agenda 2030 is in many Western countries, including in Europe, in decline. The UN is often accused of not being up to these challenges. This is certainly true, but let's not forget that the UN is not the world government. It's an intergovernmental organization. Its functioning and performance depends primarily on the political will of its member states. In order to better grasp the current state of affairs, it might be worth looking back at the very origins of the UN and briefly piece together the key moments of its evolution. So in the first part of my presentation, I will shortly trace the history of the UN from its founding to the following decades. In the second part, I will dwell on the organization's most current challenges that it is facing now. And the third and short, I promise short, the last section is devoted to Italy and its role within the UN. This year marks the 70th anniversary of Italy's membership in the organization. The idea of an international organization tasked with promoting and safeguarding peace and security emerged in the wake of the 20th century's world wars. The first attempt was made in the aftermath of World War I, when, on the initiative of the US and its president, Woodrow Wilson, as main promoter, the League of Nations was conceived. Wilson's idea and ideal was to forge an instrument that would prevent further tragic events like World War I from happening again, and that would make the world safe for democracy. The League of Nations, however, was a lame duck since its origin, as the US Congress never ratified the founding treaty, and the failure of the League was revealed by its inefficiency in stemming the aggressive revanchism of the great powers that would later cause the eruption of World War II. After World War II broke out, the project of a universal political institution to grant peace and security was revived by the Anglo-American leadership, with Roosevelt and Churchill heading lengthy negotiations with Stalin, a testament to the wartime intense diplomacy. Stepping stones of that process were the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in summer of 1944, the Yalta Conference in February 1945, and the San Francisco Conference in June of the same year, when all participating states agreed to the charter establishing the birth of the UN. However, and this needs to be reminded, the main mastermind of the entity that will become the UN was the United States, represented by President Roosevelt, and after his passing by President Truman, and then Secretary of State Cordell Hull, with a team of officers from the Department of State, led by one of the Cordell Hull's assistants, Leo Maslovsky, an intellectual journalist, who was born in Russia from a Jewish family that migrated to the US in 1905 to escape the repressive Tsarist regime. Cordell Hull was referred by Roosevelt as the father of the UN. And it is fair to say that without the US pressing for an universal organization, the UN would not have been probably founded in its current shape and form. Churchill had in mind an organization resting on a network of regional councils, and only later embraced the notion of a universal entity. The USSR was in favor of an organization whose remit would be limited exclusively to security. Unlike Wilson, Roosevelt and the then US leadership looked at the multilateral system hinging on the UN through a realist lens, rather than out of idealist or ethical concerns. It was first and foremost to protect the US economic and security interests that the US was to be engaged on the global stage, with the aim of avoiding the repetition of other world wars triggered by totalitarian powers. And to this end, there was a need to create a sturdy framework of institutions to foster peace. This was Roosevelt's calculation. All of you, I'm sure, are familiar with FDR's radio address at the dinner of the Foreign Policy Association in October 1944. I quote just a sentence of this address. A quarter of a century ago, we helped to save our freedom, but we failed to organize the kind of world in which future generations could live with freedom. Opportunity knocks again. There is no guarantee that opportunity will knock a third time. End of the quotation. In other words, in order to be sustainable, the post-World War II peace had to be institutionalized and required the US active engagement. Going back to isolationism was not an option. The UN institutional architecture was designed so as to be comprised of a Security Council in charge with the maintenance of peace and security. Veto power and permanent seats would be granted only to the victorious powers of World War II. From the US standpoint, the veto power was instrumental to preserve its sovereignty, and this was pivotal to obtain the green lights by the US Congress. Moreover, the veto power was meant to keep in check and restraining the freedom of action of other powers the USSR in particular, with the ultimate goal of lowering the risk of another world conflict. The three great powers who allied in San Francisco were united in insisting that the veto power be granted to them or they would back out. Cordell Hull stated, and I quote, "The United States would not remain one day in the UN without the veto power." Close the quotation. And this is how the veto power was thereafter included in the Article 27 of the UN Charter. Crisis management centered on the Security Council and on the 5 permanent members with the veto power, and this was inspired by Roosevelt's idea of the 4 policemen, the 3 great powers plus China, later joined by France. The US footprint in the UN project would be tracked also in the 2 other dimensions of the new international setup, namely human rights and the economy. In 1948, on the initiative of Roosevelt's wife, Eleanor, the International Bill of Rights came to life, laying the foundations for international human rights law. As to the economic dimension of the international stability, it is again thanks to the impulse of the US administration that the Bretton Woods institutions were established, the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. Harry Dexter White, a high-ranking officer from the US Treasury, played a major role alongside the British economist, the well-known John Maynard Keynes. The infrastructure of the world economy crafted by US leadership was later completed with a general agreement on tariff and trade. The San Francisco architecture resting on the UN and institutionalized alliance among the wartime victorious powers was put to test from the outset with the beginning of the Cold War and the division of the world into 2 blocks. In the following decades, and until today, the UN has been confronted basically with two types of continued tensions: the East-West antagonism and the North-South polarity that ensued after the decolonization process in Africa and in Asia, and the consequent increase in the number of the states that joined the UN, most of which were developing countries. In 1945, when the UN was first founded, it counted 51 member states. Following the subsequent decolonization waves and secessions, the total count has reached the current number of 193 states. The main platform of those countries belonged to the Global South, and the platform was the creation of a new international economic order that would address inequalities and dependency on developed nations, an aspiration that is still today on the agenda. Throughout the Cold War years, the superpower bipolar geopolitics hampered the UN's effective role in addressing crucial international crises, ranging from the 1956 crisis in Hungary to Cuba and Vietnam in the 60s. The UN regained a central role in crisis management only after Gorbachev in the Soviet Union took the helm in 1985 and after the Cold War ended. In these years, the total number of resolutions passed by the UN Security Council, in other words, they were not vetoed, grew exponentially. Moreover, the number of UN peacekeeping missions deployed in the various crisis zones spiked too, along with the peacekeeping budget. The end of the bipolar hostility paved the way to the UN joint action with a US-led coalition of 42 countries, Operation Desert Storm, to stop the Iraq invasion of Kuwait. Between 1990 and 2003, veto was cast only 12 times, as opposed to the 193 times during the first 45 years of life of the United Nations. The post-Cold War euphoria at the UN, however, did not last long. First, the failure of UN operations in former Yugoslavia, especially in Bosnia, in Somalia and Rwanda. And second, the relations between the US and Russia soured again as a result of the Kosovo crisis in 1998 and the NATO intervention without Security Council authorization. The 9/11 attacks on the Twin Towers and the shared interest in fighting terrorism brought to a resurgence of cooperation within the UN. However, soon the negative trend in the UN Security Council resurfaced in March 2003 when the US, backed by the UK and a number of other countries, invaded Iraq without Security Council approval. This was followed in 2011 by NATO's military intervention in Libya, authorized by the Security Council to protect civilians and with Russia's abstention. This operation, however, escalated in Gaddafi's removal and the regime change against Russia's will, and Russia later on regretted not vetoing the military action. These events take us to the present day crisis with a paralyzed US Security Council, incapable of adopting decisions on the major crises, in particular on Ukraine and on Gaza, because of the crossed vetoes of the two major powers, respectively Russia on Ukraine and the US on Gaza. On Ukraine, something is changing though, at least in appearance. Before Trump's return, the Security Council 5 permanent members were aligned on Ukraine as follows: the 3 Western permanent members versus China and Russia. The Trump administration and its negotiations with Russia to end the war have produced an unprecedented realignment, with the US on the same side as Russia and China against the pro-Ukraine front of UK and France. And the European non-permanent members currently sitting in the Security Council, Denmark, Greece and Slovenia, are also on the Ukraine side. Needless to say, this new US posture on Ukraine has caught Europe off guard, by surprise. But in substance, the US realignment has not changed much. It has not helped the solution of the conflict in Ukraine. If anything, it has further emboldened Russia. So far, I haven't mentioned China, whose role at the UN, both in the Security Council and in the GA, General Assembly, has become more prominent over the past 3 decades. The People's Republic of China was recognized as a legitimate representative of China to the UN only in 1971. After the first 20 years of low participation in the UN activities, Beijing has risen to prominence in all areas of the organization. It is the second contributor to the UN ordinary budget. It is the largest troops contributor to the UN missions among the P5, the 5 permanent members. It has become very vocal on development, the Belt and Road Initiative, the Global Development Initiative, and so on. Beijing has a strong sway on the Global South countries, also being member of the G77 group, which is called the G77 plus China, and has been a strong advocate of a UN-centered multilateralism, especially on development and economic matters. At the same time, China has been often reluctant to take on responsibilities to address major crises, such as Ukraine, where it aligned with Russia. It might be helpful to share some views on the 5 permanent members' use of veto in the Security Council. Since the founding of the UN, veto was cast 289 times, with the voting distributed among the P5 as follows. USSR, Russia, used the veto 135 times, that's the first. Second, US, 90 times. UK, 29 times. China, 19 times. And as of 2007, always in tandem with Russia. And France, 16 times. France and UK cast a veto for the last time in 1989. Therefore, in the past 35 years, China, Russia, and the US have used a veto power, only these three countries. The past 10 years, to see the negative trend, have seen a surge in the use of vetoes. Over the past 2 years, in particular, with the crisis in Ukraine and Gaza as a major catalyst, there has been a peak of 18 vetoes, 10 cast by Russia, 5 by the US, and 3 by China. Overall, the Middle East issue has been the most contentious, garnering 62 vetoes, the largest count in the Security Council history. Of these 62 vetoes, the US has cast 28 vetoes, Russia, USSR 22, and China 12. Why I'm giving you these numbers? Because I think that when we, definitely the UN, when we criticize the UN ineffective decision making, it is the superpowers, their rivalry and their veto skirmishing that should be blamed. On the other hand, without granting them the veto power, the UN would not be in place. What is the current situation and what are the main challenges the UN is called to tackle today? The first challenge entails, according to me, going back to basics. That is restoring the respect from the whole membership and especially the great powers and the 5 permanent members of the UN Charter, the international law and the international humanitarian law, which have been violated with the invasion of Ukraine and also in Gaza, where the humanitarian emergency has reached unprecedented levels. The other most immediate challenge stems from the liquidity crisis that risks affecting the organization's ability to operate. The UN has a limited budget encompassing assessed and voluntary contributions which cover most of the 60 billion budget overall. So mostly 2/3 voluntary contribution and 1/3 assessed contribution. The US up until now has been the major contributor, 1/3 of the overall budget. Together with Europe, if we consider the European Union contributions together with those of its 27 member states. The heavy cuts imposed by the Trump administration have caused a significant financial stress. And UN Secretary General Guterres has launched the UN 18 initiative to streamline resources with the cuts on personnel and merging of programs and funds. In the coming months, we will see the outcome of this Dodger-style set of measures. A streamlining and debureaucratization of the organization is long overdue and largely supported by the member states, but it should be carried out to make the UN stronger and not weaker. On the other hand, the effects of the US cuts on their contributions can already be detected now in the ability of the UN to operate on the ground. Notably, most of the UN budget is allocated for humanitarian programs, food emergencies, the provision of basic services, and development initiatives in low-income countries in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and island states. Many of these programs have been suspended. Another important challenge is the reform of the UN peacekeeping. There are currently 11 main UN missions undergoing all over the world, a little more than 100,000 troops deployed, most numerous in Africa, Congo, Central African Republic, South Sudan. Many of these peace missions of the last decades have had too broad and ambitious a mandate, which also included neutralizing militias, terrorist groups, protecting civilians and supporting the institutions and the rule of law without possessing the means and capacity to execute such functions. Several African countries have reacted with a growing intolerance towards long-lasting, open-ended missions, also under the banner African Solutions to African Problems. The UN mission in Mali, MINUSMA, for example, was shut down last year, and in Congo, local authorities signaled the intention to terminate the UN mission, the MONUSCO, although the plan did not go through due to its fighting against Rwanda. Based on the approach that has taken root as of late, future UN peacekeeping missions should have a more contained and targeted mandates, crafted also considering the ability of host countries to cooperate, making sure that the available resources match attainable goals, and that more space is left for regional organizations to directly manage their operations, especially the African Union. Peacekeeping, by the way, is also under financial stress. The funding of the UN missions will be impacted by the cuts announced by the United States. As to the economy, finance for development as the main tool to achieve the 2030 agenda remains also a main challenge for the UN. According to the UN figures, there is a yearly $4 trillion gap for the developing countries, exacerbated by a decrease in the ODA in developed countries, European nations included. This is a flashpoint in political and economic debates, not just at the UN, but also in the G20 and international financial institutions. An important Finance for Development Summit, the FFD4, is slated for July in Sevilla, but the perspective does not look very bright, given the US and other Western donors straying away from the development agenda in support of the 2030 agenda, and some ambiguities also from emerging economies who are today net creditors. The same applies to climate and climate finance after the US left the Paris Agreement. Here we have a mismatch between advanced and emerging economies. Emerging economies demand that industrialized countries who have polluted more and longer pay for the climate transition according to the principle of shared but differentiated responsibility. However, the advanced economies object, and with a good reason, that countries like China cannot be deemed developing economies any longer and have to take on themselves a bigger responsibility, also in financial terms. Of course, the discussion on finance for development is closely linked with the reform of the international financial architecture. The Global South want the center of international economic governance to be moved from Washington to DC, to New York, because in New York, the rule of one state, one vote applies, whereas the Bretton Woods institution's voting system tends to favor the US and the other Western countries. Moreover, as you may know, it has been common practice that the World Bank's president is from the US and the head of the IMF is from Europe. In the context of the international financial architecture reform, developing countries demand better representation in the institutions, higher flows of resources from multilateral development banks, an overhaul of the debt restructuring mechanism and the international fiscal system. But pushing through this reform agenda is an uphill battle for developing countries, and we will see how it is going to evolve in the coming months. AI, artificial intelligence, and nuclear proliferation are also two other main challenges for multilateralism and the UN. As to the AI, the bone of contention is well known. AI offers opportunities, but it also presents risks for security and for the people's rights. There are varying approaches to how AI should be regulated, with notable divergences among the US, Europe, and China. Nonetheless, we need, and this is widely recognized, we need a common framework for a light global framework that only the UN can provide. Talks are indeed underway in New York to establish an independent scientific panel the equivalent of the existing one for the climate change, that would monitor risks and opportunities associated with the AI and a political platform for intergovernmental dialogue to be convened regularly. Another aspect of AI is granting inclusivity, that is how to make sure that everyone can reap the benefits of AI without causing an additional rift between the global north and the global south. This is why global south countries warn us against the digital divide becoming a new development divide. On nuclear proliferation, the non-proliferation regime is in place since 1970, as you know, is based on the NPT, Non-Proliferation Treaty. It is predicated on three core tenets: non-proliferation, disarmament, and peaceful use of nuclear energy. India, Pakistan, Israel, and North Korea are the only states that have not signed the treaty as of today. We do not know the impact that the Israeli war against Iran will have on Iran's commitment to the NPT and to the future of NPT itself. Will the war deter proliferation, or it will further encourage it? It is fair to say that the jury is still out. In any case, the risk of proliferation has never been as high as today. And in the background, the stability of the arms control architecture also appears increasingly fragile, with the uncertainty surrounding what will happen to the next START treaty when it expires in 2026 and the NPT review conference next summer. Last but not least, but I'm not well on that, is the unsolved question of the reform of the Security Council, where there is still a discussion ongoing between two different schools of thoughts, whether we should expand the Security Council only to non-permanent members. This is a position that Italy defends, or whether the Security Council should be expanded to also to new permanent members with a veto power. It has to change. The Security Council, of course, does not reflect today's reality, but it's also true that any expansion of the Security Council needs to reconcile the inclusiveness with the effectiveness of the Security Council. I will very shortly now move to the role of Italy at the UN in this 70th anniversary. After World War II, as you know, Italy was struggling to gain recognition within the international community. We were one of the defeated Axis powers with Germany and Japan, and as such, it was not allowed to us to take part in the San Francisco conference. Italy attempted for as many as 5 times to be accepted as member of the UN, but the Cold War caused our endeavors to fall through due to the crossed vetoes between the two superpowers and to get caught in the crossfire of their bargaining. In exchange for its green light to the admission of a group of Western countries, Italy included, the USSR requested that the US let in some countries in the Soviet orbit: Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary at that time. After a 10-year-long wait, the stalemate was unlocked in 1955, when Italy finally joined the UN with other 15 states from both blocs. This marked the end of our inconvenient role as ex-enemies and the recognition of our transformation from defeated Axis power into a respected and fully fledged member of the international community. Overall, in the past 7 years, Italy has served 7 times as non-permanent member of the Security Council, has participated to numerous peace missions. Today, the mission where Italy is most engaged is in Lebanon with UNIFIL. On human rights, Italy has been on the forefront of important fights at the UN, for example, to advocate for the moratorium of the death penalty. With regards to economic and social dimensions of the UN, Italy has been elected member of the ECOSOC 11 times, and has promoted several important initiatives, especially pertaining to food security in the context of Agenda 2030. We are the seventh contributor to the UN ordinary budget and same to the UN peacekeeping budget. And Italy hosts the third largest network of UN institutions after New York and Geneva on its territory. Above all, and I conclude with Italy, Italy plays an important political role as a bridge between the global north and the global south to foster dialogue, reciprocal understanding and cooperation among Africa, Asian and Latin American and insular states. In conclusion, finally I came to this long presentation. The UN, as I said, is not a world government, but rather a mirror of the world, as the authoritative former SG Dag Hammarskjöld once said. Its function depends on member states' will, more so on the great powers' will. Even at times when this will might be lacking, a global forum where all parties can have a voice remains an advantage. And despite all the problems lamented, the UN legitimacy is universal. And also its presence on the ground in so many countries to implement projects, to provide public goods to the local population is very important, remains very important, and is maybe irreplaceable. As much as we need to be realistic in our expectations, we need to recognize that the UN is still relevant today. All member states, and let me underscore in particular Europe, have both the interest and responsibility to defend the UN and make it grow. A world without the UN will be even more divided, aggrieved, unjust and unstable than the one we have today. So let's not make things worse. I thank you for your attention. Thank you. I'm ready to take some questions if you want. Please raise your hand.
Let me first thank you, Maurizio Massari, for your excellent word result. Do you think the UN can play a role in the current crisis in terms of offering some kind of off-ramp in this situation between Israel and Iran?
To be honest with you, I think that at the current stage it's not easy for the UN to play a political role. As we know, Israel does not trust the UN. And of course, when one or two parties does not trust the organization, it will be difficult for the organization to play a role as an honest broker. So I hope that when the dust settles and there will be some kind of hopefully soon ceasefire in the UN can will be able to play a role when it comes to reconstruction, assistance, some maybe confidence building measures, implementation of these measures, but it's too early to say that. At the moment, I have to be very frank, I don't see the conditions for the UN to play a role on the conflict ongoing between Israel and Iran.
So Argos, I'm Chief Economist of Tigris Financial Partners in New York. I was raised in a big locality. My question is really simple. We are inundated by sigle, I would say, of different organizations, such as the G7, the G20, the Euro Club group in the Eurozone. My question is simply this: we're now watching the G7 take place. What is the relationship of the UN to these organizations, and how does it differentiate itself in terms of policy making and also possibly sort of leading to executive action? Because I think that's something that's confusing a lot of people and trying to understand what everybody's supposed to do, how they're doing it, and how power equilibria are being played out.
Well, thank you for this question. Future is justified. I mean, there are so many groupings and of different kind. First of all, there is a connection between both the G7, the G20, and the UN, in the sense that in the G7, which is ongoing now, in Canada, the Secretary General is present, has been invited. He was invited also last year when Italy had the presidency of the G7. The same happens with the G20. Of course, these groupings are very different. The G7 is the Western club. The G20 is the much more inclusive and representative club of today's reality. And I think that particularly the G20, it seems to me that in terms of political guidance on the economic agenda, in particular when it comes to the reform of the international architecture, finance for development, the agenda for development in general. The G20 really is a kind of preparation sometimes of what the UN will can develop further with 193 states in the General Assembly. I see a lot of commonalities between the economic agenda of the G20 and the UN agenda. The G7, as I said, is a more exclusive club, so it offers a more selective perspective of the world problems. But it's important that I think it's crucial actually for the political and economic role of the UN that the SG and the UN system in general is connected with these different groupings. But the same is also for the BRICS, as you know. The SG is also invited there. I think so the interaction is between the UN and those groupings is very important.
Thank you, sir. I'm Tali and I'm with the US Army. Now, my question is, I do understand that Italy is not one of the five powers of the UN Security Council. But I also do understand that they are a major superpower. So I'm trying to find out what is Italy's role when it comes to operations with the UN Security Council.
Italy is not a member of the Security Council as a permanent member, as the 188 other members of the UN. But as I said, first of all, it's been non-permanent member of the Security Council 7 times in these 70 years. So it means that on average, once every 10 years, we are there, we sit for 2 years in the Security Council without veto power, and we give our contribution. But, and last time we were in the Security Council, it was in 2017. Now we applied for the becoming non-permanent member in 2033, so it takes a long time. But leaving that aside, even in normal times like now, where we are not a member of the Security Council, we interact closely with the 5 plus 10 members of the Security Council on all political files which are discussed at the Security Council. Of course, I mean, with the P5, the permanent members, but also with the non-permanent members. And we try to channel our ideas, positions on different crises through the members of the Security Council. So it's an indirect role, it's not direct, but nevertheless it's important, and we'll try to do it in the best possible way.
Quick one again. So, is Italy more instrumental with NATO operations than UN security operations?
Two different things. Because in the, as you know, in the NATO, we are NATO members, so we always there, and of course we participate directly. That's the difference. Constantly to all the UN activities and operations, whereas in the UN Security Council, of course, most of the time we are not in the Security Council. Our role is indirect, and then this interaction behind the scenes or outside the Security Council room with those who are sitting there in the Security Council.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for your time. One quick question. Is there a way to, regarding the permanent Security Council members, is there a way to impose costs on them every time they issue a veto? And if not, should the UN be pushing towards ways towards imposing costs on them, whether they're political, financial, etc.?
Yeah, this is a discussion we are having in the negotiations on the reform of the Security Council, how to create a cost for those powers that use the veto. In the meantime, already there has been some breakthrough 2 years ago. A resolution has been adopted by the General Assembly, which is on the veto initiative, which basically obliges those permanent members that use the veto automatically within 10 days to go to the General Assembly to explain the reasons why they use this veto. This is in a way, it's already something to create a minimum of accountability. Having said that, a veto is a veto. It's very hard to think that the P5, particularly the P3, because as I said, the UK and France are not making use of the veto since '89. It's hard to think that the P3 will accept any mandatory, any obligation to dilute this veto power that they regard as an absolute power. As I tried to explain, without veto, they would not be there, so the UN would not exist.
Your Excellency, thank you for your comments. And my question is, any organization in business has to evolve as the condition changes. In this case, the UN, as the world continues to change, needs to evolve. How do you see the UN evolving to meet the challenges ahead?
I think it's evolution is already, it is a process ongoing. I think the initiative of UN 80 that I mentioned, taken by the Secretary General to streamline the organization, to make it simpler, is a good one in the sense that it will make it easier to understand what the UN does. No? I mean, in the area of development, in the area of security, in the area of education, and so on and so forth. But I think, to be honest with you, I think we should reconnect to better the UN to the capitals of the member states, and to see what kind of UN really the member states want. In that sense, the evolution of the UN, because this is the intergovernmental organization, so solutions cannot be imposed from above, have to be agreed consensually by member states, and should be made more clear than it is now what member states really want the UN to do. What is the business model of the UN? One criticism, for example, that I tend to subscribe, the UN is a lot about processes, negotiations that take the entire year, for example, to produce, to agree on documents that are not binding in the first place, but also that they do not have a clear impact, they don't get any traction, political traction in our capitals. So in that sense, one possible evolution, I think would be healthy for the UN is to reduce the number of this process, to produce less documents, maybe to showcase more concrete actions, implementation projects, development projects on the ground for developing countries, and also to try to recuperate some role in the solution of political crisis. Because so far, it is a fact that on the major crisis, whether it is Iran or Ukraine or Gaza, the role of the UN as such is very limited. So I think that there should be a reflection in this evolution on how to play a role of peace and security, which is more visible than people out there expect the UN to play. And second, to be maybe less bureaucratic, produce less documents, produce less texts and stuff, and to demonstrate more with concrete actions on the ground what they can do to make the world more just, fair, and to share prosperity and stability. That says, I don't know if I respond to your question, but I think there should be, to sum it up, I think it's a very important question, but they cannot, the UN has to evolve, but it's not possible to have solutions imposed from the outside, because at the end of the day it remains intergovernmental. So the evolution has to follow the will of the member states, and the member states should be very clear what they expect the UN to do, what they want to do. And I think here we could get definitely different responses, because, for example, if you ask countries from the global south, the global south is a very broad category, but they would like to see the UN to do as much as possible. Maybe you don't get the same response in the G7 that the question was asked before. So what in the 21st century the UN should focus upon? And there must be a discussion, and then that's I never saw I've been almost 4 years in this job. I haven't seen a substantive discussion among member states on that. Because also the meetings, being in 193 member states, they come as a sort of succession of statements with a very little interaction, whereas there should be a moment of interactive dialogue, but at the highest level, to see in what direction the UN should go, how should evolve in a time where everything has become very different, and where should you focus? This without neglecting that some evolution is already ongoing. For example, artificial intelligence, the UN has been pretty active, and it's a demonstration that some evolution is ongoing. The AI resolutions have been passed, even with the agreement of Russia and China, by the way, or these negotiations on the creation of the panel, on the independent panel as the model on the panel of experts of the climate change. the attempt to create a framework of common principles. So on the AI, for example, we see that the UN is moving quite well for whatever it can do, of course. But as I said, there should be a guidance should come from the member states.
Thinking again about the situation with Israel and Iran, perhaps I'm naive, but wouldn't it be nice if all the member states of the UN had to agree that other states had the right to exist? If we insisted on, if the UN said that each state had to agree that other states who were in the UN agreed that everyone else had the right to exist. If that was being said by the UN right now, might that help negotiations happen now between Iran and Israel?
Well, thanks for the question. Of course, being if you're part of the UN, of course, you, as such, you exist on a different level of the UN. And I don't now recall of recent statements, but I think it's in our national statements, let's put it this way, it's Italy, the European Union, but I think the majority of member states, when we're having this discussion in the General Assembly, we all state the right of Israel to exist. It's I don't know if it is it's not loud enough, but we all say that because I say again the UN is the member states and it's 193 member states with maybe few exceptions. We all state that the right of Israel to exist. I have to say, just to finish my point. I have to say that also the highest authorities at the UN, they stated over and over again about the Israel right to exist. Also, we when it comes to self-defense, as well, this is which is by the way also embodied in the UN Charter, in Article 51. Of course, I mean. Also, when it comes to self-defense, where do you then to draw the line? This is an open debate of proportionality and these kind of things. But I don't want to give the false impression that this absolutely legitimate right of every member state, and including, of course, Israel, because we are talking about the war between Israel and Iran, as the right to exist. Now, Iran denies, as we know. No?
So maybe they shouldn't, if a country doesn't allow it, they shouldn't be allowed to be in the UN.
Well, this is a question. I see your point. As you know, the UN Charter does not make too many distinctions between, for example, different types of states. I mean, whether you are a democratic state or democratic state, you're a peace-loving state, no? Yeah. And certainly, when you deny the right to exist, other states, of course, this is in contradiction with the UN Charter. But as I said, this has been stressed by most of us, I would say. I see a lot of colleagues here when we speak on that topic at the UN, that is to deny the right of existence to another member states is absolutely absolutely contrary to the spirit of the Charter, as well as we said many times about the right of territorial integrity, independence, sovereignty of member states, as in the case of Ukraine, that, as you know, has created many discussions, but most of member states with resolutions which are passed with 130 votes have stated the right of each state to sovereignty and territorial integrity. Thanks.
Ambassador Massari, thank you very much for sharing your insights with us this evening.